Ladies and gentlemen, youth's emergence as political actors in the aftermath of the Arab Spring should not come as a surprise. 65% of the region's population is under the age of 30. At the onset of the Arab Spring, the youth faced a set of economic grievances ranging from high unemployment rates to a rising cost of living. They also felt politically disempowered. The advent of youth as a major fault line of popular mobilization in the region was also partly a result of the increasing use of social media. Tech-savvy youth became capable of bypassing traditional modes of communication, organizing demonstrations, and providing an alternative narrative. It was then only natural that the youth were at the forefront of protests and demonstrations at the beginning of the Arab Spring, starting with the Tunisian Revolution, and which became the catalyst for a lot of for mobilization all over the Arab world. However, not only are the youth hard to engage, they are also easily manipulated. In Egypt, we saw anti-Mubarak protesters turn overnight into a pro-army, anti-brotherhood. This exposed some of the problematic elements of youth activism. Youth groups are not unified by one ideology. They are less willing and less able to strike deals with governments, and they make unrealistic and undeliverable demands on government. The youth are also decentralized actors. This ultimately becomes a challenge when foreign and internal actors try to engage with them in the absence of any clear leadership. With these factors in mind, I will now turn to the Gulf. Discussion of activism in the Gulf, and especially youth activism, has often been neglected in comparison to the rest of the region. It is important to look beyond the cliched stereotypes that describe young Gulf citizens as lazy and politically apathetic. Youth activism is indeed a recent introduction to the political scene in the Gulf. While in the past, youth may have been inhibited by patriarchal authority, they have recently become the main driver for political change. Probably one of the earliest examples is the 2006 political movement in Kuwait, which pushed for reforming the electoral districts. So political mobilization in the Gulf has indeed been less obvious and less public in the past. Nonetheless, the Gulf's strategic positioning ultimately makes unrest in any Gulf state have a regional and even a global impact. Set against the backdrop of Saudi-Iranian rivalries, increasing sectarianism and regional upheaval, it is really hard for us to look at activism in the Gulf and popular mobilization as just purely local dynamics. Even though popular contestation in the Gulf predated the events of the Arab Spring, Gulf citizens capitalized on this opportunity to voice their grievances to their governments. In Kuwait, popular mobilization against government corruption eventually led to the forced resignation of Prime Minister Nasser Mohammed in November 2011. In Oman, predominantly economic grievances led to a series of demonstrations in the capital city, Muscat, and the northern city of Suhar in February 2011. In Saudi Arabia, mobilization was most evident in the eastern province, whose Shia residents protested what they perceived was state discrimination. The largest mobilization and the most consequential took place in Bahrain between February and March 2011. Some estimated numbers go up to 100,000. A combination of political, economic, and social grievances led to large protests in the center of the capital, Manama. Though the movement's original demands revolved around reforming the system, the predominantly Shia demonstrations eventually escalated their demands to seeking regime change. In the UAE, more than 100 Emirati intellectuals submitted in March 2011 a petition to their rulers demanding the introduction of elected parliament, while the government cracked down on what it viewed it to be a threat by the local branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. Finally, in Qatar, we saw no significant internal unrest in spite of the country's large diplomatic footprint. I would then like to highlight 4 main elements of activism in the Gulf. First, we have to keep in mind that severe political, social, and economic hardship is not widespread amongst the indigenous communities of the Gulf. That said, the rentier state model is no longer working as well as it did a few decades ago. In some Gulf countries, it has become increasingly difficult for the state to offer the same welfare package to its youth as it did in the past. In fact, unemployment rates can be higher in some Gulf states than in some other states, Arab states. Saudi Arabia has an estimated youth unemployment rate of 40%. It now takes months, if not years, for young people in the Gulf to secure a job. Governments are put under immense pressure to create jobs in Saudi Arabia, Oman, and in Bahrain. Additionally, the growing populations combined with rising real estate prices, urbanization, and the monopolistic practices of elites have made it difficult for young Gulf citizens to obtain affordable housing. The youth, among other segments of the society, continue to see themselves as excluded from the decision-making process. Even in the Gulf states where we see elections taking place, in Kuwait and in Bahrain, the youth have become disillusioned by politicians wrangling and their inability to deliver. In a recent Booz and Company survey, 63% of young Gulf citizens were surveyed, and they said that they would like to see their governments give young people increased access to the decision-making process and policy implementation at the local level. These issues then are just as real for the Gulf as they are for the rest of the region, and if they are not addressed, they will only gain in prominence. Secondly, just like the rest of the region, youth activism has problematic elements. In the Gulf, youth activists are often confronted with sectarianism, tribalism, and radicalization, which they deal with in different ways. The youth are only one layer of political activism. At times, we saw youth breaking away from traditional political groups as they reject mobilization according to sectarian or tribal rhetoric. For instance, the youth movement in Kuwait has done a lot to bridge the gap between the urbanite and the tribal demographics. In 2012, the February 2012 elections, they rose against and they rejected the long-standing tradition of tribal primaries in which big tribes select their representatives in parliament. A lot viewed this to be attributed this to a sense of unity between tribal and urbanite youth, given their joint activism in opposition youth movements. However, some youth movements can be negatively influenced by sectarian and tribal rhetoric. We see indications of this happening in Bahrain. While the youth-driven political mobilization at the beginning of 2011 displayed elements of cross-sectarian coordination, this unfortunately is no longer the case. Recently, there has been a turn to violence by youth who have formed amateur militant groups, such as the Holy Defense Brigade, which uses sectarian imagery and symbols. At the same time, we are seeing an increasing trend of Sunni youth mobilization against the opposition, functioning as a counter-revolutionary force. This ultimately exacerbates sectarian divisions within society. Youth activists tend to be impatient, not believing in gradual change or partial reforms to the system. They demand immediate changes to the status quo. They lack the gradualist approach of more traditional political groupings. However, at the same time, this urgency has brought about positive results. For instance, the youth in Kuwait were the driving force behind popular mobilization that led to the reform of the electoral districts in 2006. Again, in 2011, youth in Kuwait exerted pressures on the government, which eventually forced the resignation of the prime minister. Yes, there are problematic elements to youth activism, but their energy and their drive has, in many cases, revitalized standing opposition movements and made it possible to achieve feats that were in the past considered unrealistic. Third, economic, political, and societal differences between the Gulf states made mobilization possible in some states, but non-existent in others. The robustness of Kuwait and Bahrain's civil societies has created a relatively open political environment in which there is public discussion of critical issues. Additionally, Kuwait and Bahrain's parliamentary experiments have created official venues for engagement with the government. Despite their shortcomings, these parliaments are important tools to creating awareness of a range of social, political, and economic issues. A history of parliamentary participation and campaigning combined with Bahrain and Kuwait's relatively open political environment have facilitated popular mobilization. Furthermore, the economic issues that I already mentioned in the Gulf, such as unemployment, low wages, and housing crises, are more acute in some Gulf states than in others. The relative economic affluence of states such as Qatar and the UAE combined with their small homogeneous populations, have to a large extent spared them from dealing with major internal unrest. Finally, governments in the Gulf often respond to popular mobilization by a combination of carrots and sticks. This only restores balance temporarily. During the first months of the Arab Spring, Gulf governments, in anticipation of potential internal unrest, resorted to announcing large welfare economic packages to their citizens. Saudi Arabia dedicated $130 billion to increase salaries, build housing projects, and fund religious organizations. Bahrain announced that would give every family around $2,500. Kuwait gave every citizen $3,500. The GCC set up a $20 billion Marshall Plan for Bahrain and Oman to improve their infrastructure and their housing over the course of 10 years. Furthermore, governments attempted to accommodate some of the demands of their citizens. At the beginning of the Bahraini crisis, we saw a national dialogue was announced and a cabinet shuffle. Oman announced the creation of 50,000 jobs, and a third of the cabinet was dismissed. In Saudi Arabia, women were given the right to vote. Governments also engaged with the public. For instance, in Kuwait, ministers met with youth representatives and activists to allow them to voice their grievances. And the royal court set up a youth project which was supposed to provide direct engagement with government and parliament. On the other hand, the past 2 years we have seen governments also adopt harsher security measures. There are more regulations today imposed on unlicensed demonstrations, along with restrictions on media and freedom of speech. The UAE passed a new cybercrime law allowing the government to prosecute internet users who may be undermining the state. Both Bahrain and Kuwait considered introducing controversial new media laws. Prosecution of activists has also become a more common occurrence. In Kuwait, activists and former parliamentarians were put on trial on charges relating to insulting the emir. And close to 100 Muslim Brotherhood affiliates were put on trial in the UAE over charges of planning to overthrow the government. Clashes between security forces and demonstrators have led in the past to injuries and sometimes deaths, as we saw in the case of Bahrain. Now, as I come to the end of my remarks, I think it is important to note that some of the dynamics I have described today, especially with regards to youth activism, is not particularly unique to the Arab region or the Gulf. Nonetheless, youth mobilization in the Gulf is notable in that it is a recent phenomenon that has quickly risen to becoming a defining feature of several Gulf states. By breaking away from traditional political movements, the youth have proven not only that they can no longer be ignored, but also that they can often become the main driver for change. I look forward to your comments.